Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain. I want to welcome you to this special presentation. What does global trade look like in 2025? Preparing your supply chain for a future under the new administration, presented by Thomson Reuters. Quick reminder, there will be a question and answer session, an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is time to prepare your supply chain for the future under a new administration. Today, we're going to equip you with vital insights into strengthening supply chain resilience amidst new challenges. Drawing from Thomson Reuters' 2024 Global Trade Report, we will explore the intricacies of supply chain vulnerabilities, regulatory changes, and geopolitical dynamics that businesses are currently confronting. You'll gain a thorough understanding of how these factors intersect and shape global trade operations as a result of the new administration's policies. With that, I want to introduce our speakers for today. Andrew Moxon is Senior Product Marketing Manager for OneSource Global Trade with Thomson Reuters. He joined the firm in 2010 with the acquisition of the Boskage International Trade Information business, which he managed from 2001 to 2019. Andrew has been a licensed U.S. customs broker since 2004 and is author of the Boskage Customs Broker Exam Preparation Course. Marianne Rowden is CEO and Director of the E-Merchants Trade Council, Inc., a global trade association for e-commerce entrepreneurs for supporting simplification of trade, tax, and transportation policies. EMTC is the accrediting body for the ISO/IEC 17024 certification of global trade professionals and a partner accreditor for CBP's LCB continuing education program. So with that, I want to turn it over to Andrew Moxon for a brief presentation. Andrew, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you. Our topic today is what global trade looks like in 2025. And to start out, it is my privilege to walk through the results we see in the latest annual report on global trade commissioned by the Thomson Reuters Institute in order to set up some of the main themes we're seeing around the world to give us some topics around which to guide our conversation. This is a report based on a survey that we in Thomson Reuters send out to trade professionals each year, targeting upper-level executives, directors, and managers involved in various aspects of global trade in North America, the EU and UK, Latin America, and Asia Pacific. And if you watch till the end, we'll give you a link where you can download it for yourself. It's important to note that this survey was concluded in September of last year, and we should acknowledge that the results of the U.S. election have likely transformed the global outlook on trade to a degree. However, it's still worth calling out these trends that we see in the report, particularly since the watchwords were complexity and disruption, and in my humble opinion, that's not changing, even if some of the focus of where these disruptions and complexities may be coming from have. Here we see one of our global trade report main results, which shows that disruption in the supply chain was already the primary concern for respondents, and most of the other issues fall under the label of disruption as well. And what's number two but one of our biggest sources of complexity, which is regulation, and what's number three but one of the biggest sources of disruption, which is international politics. So let's start with the international politics first. Because I have to guess that what a poll today would return, I think this might go to number one. Politically related disruptions are an ongoing reality in global trade. And events this year have certainly borne that out, probably most prominently in many of the way the new U.S. president's actions and proposals, which include 25% tariffs on Mexican and Canadian imports, up to 200% on Chinese EVs, and many others as well. And we can expect more disruption. Even this weekend, we saw a dust-up over deportees turn into a trade dispute with Colombia. So these are realignments of a status quo that are going to have impacts on global trade flows and introduce new challenges, also new opportunities. But one thing that hasn't changed is our next theme, another kind of disruption, and that's skills and talent. So there's a skills gap, and our responses for Global Trade Report have been clear over the years. To an extent, exacerbating this gap, to an extent causing it, the regulatory landscape is getting more complex. And so are the regulatory requirements upon corporations. And that means that the skills needed for ensuring compliance and securing cost savings are changing as well. This highlights the pressing need for education and awareness, but it also means that corporations are increasingly turning to automation, software, and emerging technological solutions to fill the gap. And that brings us to our next theme, which is technology. So the sheer number of regulations and the mountain of data involved means that the days of relying on manual tools has been long gone for a long time. But increasingly, we're seeing a rise in interest in emerging technologies and an increased focus on automation to meet those challenges. And technologies that solve for complex problems are themselves complex. So we're seeing corporations who struggle with the skills gap turn to specialized consultants and managed service providers to procure and set up, maintain, sometimes even run those solutions on behalf of their companies. And few areas are more complex than our final theme, and that's the growing area of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG regulation. The requirements here increasingly require radical transparency and require mapping supply chains of not only vendors, but of their vendors, and so on, which has seen companies seeking diversification and resiliency in their trade lanes to avoid trouble spots. And that means moving beyond single suppliers. That's something that comes with its own set of challenges and risks in order to make sure that you are vetting correctly. And in the end, it's about making sure that the supply chain is ethical and resilient in order to ensure that companies are avoiding the reputational, financial, and operational risk that attends noncompliance. So those are the themes: complexity and disruption, most prominently political disruption these days, and regulations like ESG driving a need for resilient and diverse supply chains, and a skills gap that is also an ongoing transformation of needed skills, which necessitates education and technology. So I'm going to pass it back to Bob, and thank you
Yeah,
very much.
thank you very much, Andrew. With this, let's bring back Marianne Rowden as well of the E-Merchants Trade Council, who will be answering a lot of the questions I want to direct to the panel today. Now, as you know, Andrew just laid out for you these four major themes under this broader topic, and so I'd like to organize our panel discussion in a similar fashion. Let's take them one at a time. Let's start with theme number one, that is navigating the new trade landscape, the Trump administration, and policy changes and implications of those. So, Marianne, what, in your opinion, are the ramifications of Trump's proposed policy changes in relation to tariffs? And for that matter, who is in charge of tariffs and trade policy?
Well, Bob, that's the key question in this administration. Before he came into office, President Trump threatened a whole range of tariffs. For example, 100% tariffs on BRIC countries, 25% against Canada and Mexico, our top trading partners. And as Andrew alluded to, now that the president has taken office, he has already used those tariffs against, or the threat of tariffs against Colombia. So tariffs is not just a trade issue anymore. It is the instrument through which the president will exert leverage over other countries for a wide variety of issues and not just trade issues. The other thing that we have seen over the last couple of weeks in the waning days of the Biden administration is that U.S. Customs and Border Protection released two proposed regulations on the entry of low-value shipments. So these are shipments that are taking advantage of the administrative exemption of de minimis under 19 U.S.C. 1321. And those low-value shipments, they overlap, and it's not synonymous with e-commerce, but a lot of direct-to-consumer shipments come in through that supply chain. And these proposed rules will drastically restrict or eliminate certain shipments from using that administrative exemption. And that accounts for over 90% of the shipments that are imported into the U.S. So those are very significant, and we'll continue to see the use of 301 tariffs related to China with IPR violations, 232, which is national security, and 201, which is anti-dumping countervailing duties. And then finally, I would just note that the president did post, I believe on January 20th, a document called the America First Trade Policy. And it is a wholesale directive to all trade officials to review all U.S. trade policy and report back to them by April 1st. So we'll see some significant changes.
Yeah, and I think also another factor to all of this, Marianne, is that it's not just the actions of the new administration on the U.S. side, but the reactions, right? This isn't
Mhm.
going to be a unilateral situation, so it adds a kind of a quantum level of complexity potentially as we think about what not only what might the Trump administration do, but what are each country that are targeted by those methodologies. Pretty much all countries. What are they going to do, and
Right.
how fractal could this become?
I agree with you.
Certainly seems like some form of retaliation would almost be inevitable, but I guess that's something we'll have to see. So Marianne, there is an awful lot of confusion right now as to what's going on with the various government agencies, who's going to
Mhm.
be in them, who's going to be running them, what they're going to be doing. So I guess I'm wondering, how can businesses in this environment of uncertainty effectively engage with these government agencies on trade policy issues?
I think that's a really important question. Obviously, the Secretary of Treasury was confirmed the other day, so that's good news. But it's not clear because the Secretary of Commerce nominee, Howard Lutnick, indicated he was going to be ahead, in charge of trade and tariff policy, including USTR, even though USTR is a separate cabinet official. And it may be the president himself is going to be his own lead trade official, which would not surprise me. And so this, where to, um, I think the challenge for most businesses is time and money. Where do you direct that energy of your government affairs representatives or your trade associations? And it may be all of the above until there's more clarity.
Hmm. Andrew, let's take, kind of zoom out a little and take a larger view of things that with all of the geopolitical tensions and the wars and things that are happening in the world today, how do they impact global trade flows and overall supply chain stability?
To a great degree, I would say. I mean, geopolitical disruptions are highly placed in the realm of concerns. Even prior to the election, they were number three in that ranked chart that I showed earlier. I think they're part of a larger subset of disruption that has become inevitable in the modern trade landscape. So I would say that what these geopolitical tensions do is have kind of a multiplier effect to what may have already been present. So you could talk about labor or the dock workers strike last year, or trade disputes between U.S. and EU, or EU and China, and the retaliatory tariffs there. All of those things, have had their impact, and now I think we're going to see tariffs probably be a much bigger thing in the post-election world,
Mhm.
and post-Biden world. So we might guess. I mean, I don't think we have to guess anymore. They are really the dominant theme as we're going into the new year. But we
Mhm.
place it within the context of all sorts of other disruptions, natural disruptions, accidents, catastrophes,
Mhm.
shortages of labor, shortages of critical goods like containers. All of these disruptions, the thing about them is they are hard to predict, but each year they come. So there's a certain inevitability. So the question is how to become resilient. And I think that those are the things that are really pushing the trade in the directions that we see, right?
Resilient supposedly is to diversify your supplier base, do things like explore options like nearshoring to
Hmm.
North or South America. But that option seems to be a little bit in jeopardy in light of the president's actions against Colombia the other day. So it's quite a chaotic situation for traders thinking that, well, I'll simply diversify my supplier base, but maybe I don't even know
Right.
where I will diversify it to, right?
Yeah, and you can't even really just think of it as an import, like a tariff import situation, because also there's geopolitically charged export control laws, right?
Mhm.
Right.
So export license requirements, exceptions, variations, there's sanctions, there's embargoes. A year ago, what everyone was talking about was not so much tariffs, but export restrictions, right, and other government agencies. So you're seeing a lot more happening in the area of technology with quantum computing, everything tech, semiconductors. And so if you look at just even what we saw in the years of the Biden administration, there was a constant flow of that going as well. So even as everyone's focusing on tariffs, those things haven't gone away either. So the complexities are definitely very real.
Marianne, what role do you think that governments actually play, or what role should they play in supporting global trade?
I hold the traditional view that government should set the rules for a level playing field. I think that when governments get into subsidies or industrial policy, it tends to be misguided. But even in the specific trade space, I'm a minority. I don't support partnership programs anymore, like CTPAT, because I think the obligations outweigh the benefits. And they've been used as a way to expand the basis of the partnership. So CTPAT, for example, was designed for supply chain security, and now it's the mainstay of how CBP is enforcing UFLPA, or forced labor, which it was never designed to do. So I think government should return to their traditional role, but I don't see that happening over the next couple of years.
Well, interesting.
I think I would
CT
add
Pataco.
too
Yeah, go
that
ahead.
trade professionals are just thirsty for regulatory clarity. These
Mhm.
these regulations are very sweeping in some cases, and how are those expectations going to be measured? How are they going to be tracked? And so there's really thirst for that. And the more transparency, if we're talking about how should they engage, I'd say the more transparency the agencies responsible for enforcing these regulations can bring to those questions, the better. And I think the complexity is a challenge on that end as well.
CTPAT, of course, is Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, which was that
Right.
voluntary program, which has been going on for a few years now. Interesting, your views on that, Marianne. Marianne, also, the role of customs itself, of Customs and Border Protection,
Mhm.
it's supposed to be twofold. It's supposed to be enforcement and facilitation, and yet there doesn't seem to be much room for facilitation these days. And I'm wondering if customs' role in that area is just shrinking because we're spending so much time on enforcement and sending thousands of customs officers to the borders. Will that go away, do you think, and will that affect how traders should be communicating and collaborating with customs these days?
Well, Bob, that's a great observation. We have to realize that the post-World War II era of trade liberalization, US-led trade liberalization, is over. And I kind of felt that way before President Trump was elected the first time. But again, I was a minority view. CBP has gotten out of the trade facilitation business a long time ago, and this has been happening probably over the last 8 years as immigration and forced labor and other issues have come to the fore. Um, One of the things that has happened that has many of us in the trade community alarmed is that a couple months ago, I think it was started in August, they put the original Treasury Inspector General report, and then it was codified in Treasury Decision or Treasury Directive 100-20 and 100-21, is that Treasury gave its jurisdiction and authority over customs revenue function, which includes tariffs, over the Department of Homeland Security without notifying Congress or the trade community. Now, under the Homeland Security Act that was passed, back in 2002, it split the jurisdiction over CBP, which traditionally was a Treasury, between Treasury and the Department of Homeland Security. And so this is really alarming. So you have an incoming administration and a president talking about tariffs, and nobody realizes the Treasury gave away that authority. So we are engaging with Congress to reverse that because, your CBP is losing its customs, um, character in a way as a revenue generating agency. So it's very alarming.
Yeah, how interesting. Well, let's move on to the second of our major themes in our discussion today, and that is bridging the talent and skills gap. So, Marianne, given the rapid evolution of the global trade landscape, how
Mhm.
can we best address this skills gap within the trade profession?
First of all, we need to recognize that trade compliance is actually a profession. It's a multidisciplinary, um, you know, profession, and we have a lot of liability in a way. People only recognize both trade compliance and supply chain when things go wrong. And things have been going on wrong in the last couple of
Yeah,
years.
for sure.
So for most of my career, my parents had no idea what I did for a living, and now they do. So that's first and foremost. We have to realize that trade compliance, a lot more functions and a lot more responsibility and liability is being imposed on the supply chain. We've talked about supply chain security, but also for false labor. That also includes environmental issues like the CBAM, the border adjustment taxes for greenhouse gases intensive goods. That's the European model, and there's been some discussion in the United States about adopting that. So the trade professionals have to handle all of that. So our portfolio is growing. Secondly, we need to work with academic institutions because there's a real big gap between the industry that's now becoming a profession and the academy. And that's because, so I've been an adjunct professor over 20 years, and academic institutions really want people with PhDs for an area, a discipline worthy of academic research. Now, supply chain had the luxury of Harvard Business School discovering logistics as supply chain. And you had a lot of people with a business background really researching that area. I think the same will be true to trade compliance to a certain degree, and we are trying to do that. So as you noted in the introduction, EMTC is an accreditor for an ISO-based standard, which is the training of professionals. And what we've done with our partners is develop that specifically for trade professionals. And now you also have CBP in its broker modernization of Part 111, having rolled out a continuing education mandate for licensed customs brokers. And so we are an accreditor for that program as well. So these are good bases upon which to have a profession with lifelong learning. And I think that will help in getting those professionals, both new professionals, but also more senior professionals, to take courses for the expanding role and knowledge base that we need.
Yeah. Andrew, what do you think about that, about the broadening list of skills that a supply chain professional has to do today, especially with regard to technology and knowledge of analytics and stuff like that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's just undeniable. The level of skill that is needed has expanded and has exploded, and I think I agree with everything Marianne said about what the academy can do there. I think we're also seeing that corporations are just turning to service providers and consultants to
Mm-hmm.
manage the gap, right?
Mm.
Where they know that there are people who can do this. I don't know if it's a return to the heyday of all things through, pre 1994 Modernization Act, all things through the broker, but we're definitely seeing more and more outsourcing, not just to procure the
Mm-hmm.
software, but in some cases to run it, and just to fill in the gap of that expanding need. So I think what you see with service providers versus the academy is a real strong understanding, not only of what the regulation and the business aspect of trade, but the nuts and bolts of the technology that's available and the
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
deep network within the trade ecosystem to be able to help scale that up. And then I think the associations really just fill in the middle ground between those two.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. I guess there's also the question of bringing up younger people, younger generations to step into these roles too, and the degree to which they're interested in doing so, or even are aware of the opportunities. Marianne, you yourself said that a few years ago, the community outside of our world didn't know, had no idea what we were doing. They didn't even know what a supply chain was. I'm wondering now if the higher recognition of the importance of supply chain in the post-COVID era is actually a positive thing in that it's going to attract more people, younger people, with these additional skills.
I certainly hope so. Um, I had the luxury for most of when I was an adjunct professor, to actually teach what I did. So I taught U.S. import-export law, and it was in a Master's of Law program. And many of those students went on to have a fabulous career. I think the public in general is much more aware of how much supply chain and globalization touches their lives. And that certainly is true in the post-COVID period, where there was that real shift to that supply chain. The question is whether it can be considered cool. The one of the challenges I think with this period is I've noticed a lot of people at the senior level have just had enough. They say, I'm ready to retire because it gets
Right.
to a point where a lot of us had fun, doing trade compliance, and you have what I call a trade nerd personality. And I think that just simply reflects it being harder because of the lack of policy clarity, and that we are sort of the shock absorbers of the system. And so a lot of what we've been doing is try to integrate the new areas into those compliance programs, and it hasn't been fun. But hopefully those things will be ironed out, and we are dealing in a new era of globalization. We're probably at peak total globalization, and maybe we're going into a period of regionalization. But hopefully, young people will find it an intriguing area. And certainly the jobs are proliferating. The job boards that I work with and the recruiters, as Andrew mentioned, on the export control side, it is exploding. The sanction side.
Yeah.
So there is a dynamism to the trade compliance profession that I think we haven't seen in a long time.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to our next big theme, and that is technological advancements in global trade. This, of course, is essential to talk about. I guess maybe I should ask first, Marianne, in your opinion, how are technologies like artificial intelligence and blockchain transforming global trade?
This period reminds me a lot of the 1990s, right before the dot-com bubble, where there was a lot of investment in supply chain technologies. And of course, there was a big shakeout during the dot-com era. The difference this time is people are more prudent in where they're making their investments. And these are real companies with real paying customers, right? There have been initial efforts by many companies that showed promise, but were not sustainable. I think now we're in a different era. I have felt that the combination of technologies, both machine learning and artificial intelligence and things like blockchain, do solve certain issues that are unique to the trade and supply chain business, which is you have a lot of people, you have a fragmented landscape of a lot of players in that supply chain. And how do you get the best information that is immutable? So blockchain, for example, does solve a lot of problems for us, but we need bottom-up solutions, and that's very difficult. There are so many companies that are out there, whether they're using AI for tariff classification or other issues. And certainly the global trade management companies are having to keep up. So we're just in the beginning stages, and I see a lot of trade compliance professionals saying, yeah, we're looking at these technologies, but you really have to put it through its paces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the data that I've seen uh, is very aligned with that. It suggests we know that interest in AI is high. It's a buzzword. It's more than a buzzword. It's something that people are using, right? But it's definitely there's a buzz. But nobody's getting an AI solution just to have an AI solution,
Right.
right? There's that governance that Marianne's talking about. And so the people who are going to be making these purchase decisions, they're going to have to see the proof of efficacy. They're going to have to see the ROI, and they are going to want to make sure that it's an existing stable company, much more so than as Marianne points out, dot-com bubble. Um,
Hmm.
so I think what it's going to take are those global trade AI tools with established track records and use cases, that can prove out the claims.
Yeah. I mean, you have to hope we're not going to see an AI bubble that,
Right.
all of this hype's going to settle down. It's hard to imagine. I mean, AI certainly does seem like a really powerful technology that's real. But I guess we'll just have to see how that manifests itself. And, of course, as you say, results are what matters. So the question here, Marianne, is how can companies leverage these technologies to actually improve supply chain visibility and efficiency?
Well, I think that for trade compliance and supply chain, we're all about focusing on the risk, right?
Hmm.
And what risk are you trying to manage and the attributes or features of that technology that manage risk? For example, as I noted before, does the immutability of blockchain provide a solution to track product description, value, origin, free trade agreement qualification, certificates of origin, better than a database? And one of the things that many multinational companies face, or the trade professionals in those companies, are having to deal with a variety of systems. So I'm always floored by the trade pros who say, yeah, I still use spreadsheets because I have to download data from one system and
Hmm.
then analyze it and then upload it to another system. So I think to the degree that AI can be used to pull that data together and really turn it into information would be a great efficiency, because then you're able to leverage that AI into from data to real information that is actionable.
Hmm. Okay. I want to hear a little bit more about how one can evaluate this flood of technologies, how you can decide to what you should be committing resources, how you should be adopting these technologies for trade
Mhm.
compliance, for specific supply chain functions. Talk more, Marianne, about the metrics that you need to use in order to even gauge the success of these tools, evaluate them beforehand, and then evaluate their success once you've adopted them.
One of the things that EMTC did, we were part of the larger group that was trying to negotiate the 21st Century Customs Framework, which is the new customs modernization law.
Hmm.
So we had meetings with CBP over the course of a year to come up, and it was a subset of the Customs Operations Advisory Committee, or COAC. And then COAC forwarded their recommendations to Congress. But one of the things that we did out of frustration is that we developed a red line of Title 19 to sort of integrate into the statutory framework the acceptance of technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence. And what we wrote is that CBP should accept customs decisions made by machine learning or artificial intelligence if the company could demonstrate that it was using a risk assessment methodology with that technology. Um, so that's an important framework that we should have that really hasn't gone anywhere. So now the question is, how do you put these technologies through its paces? So one of the things that I've seen many people talk about for AI for tariff classification is give 10 different examples of different types of products to classify, whether it's EO nominee, a use case, and or how it's made, and give very examples. And I've seen a wide range of experiences, and there's different companies out there that use different types of technologies. And so we're just in the beginning stages of that. And I'd like to see, the companies really be compared feature by feature, but you have to get under the hood of how that technology works.
Yeah.
And I think that the proof is going to be there in a responsible provisioning process where you do the stress testing that you're talking about, Marianne, but also just look for the use cases. In the
Mhm.
case of something emerging, who are the pilot partner corporations and
Mhm.
and what were the KPI? What's backing the solution you mentioned, Marianne? Is it a real company with real customers? But the other thing I'd watch for is it integrated into your business systems, right? So you can use the results seamlessly. And does it learn from your business systems? But maybe even more importantly, does it give you the control of how much you want it to learn from your business systems, right? Does it help you identify errors in your data? Does it make you go through the results to verify them? Even if the initial stress test has issues, are there things in the use cases, the pilot programs, the case studies that indicate that those things will continually get better? Because that's sort of one of the powers of the AI value proposition, right? Is that it's not only going to make things better for you and more efficient, but it will become more efficient as it learns.
Yeah.
So is it trying to replace your expertise? That should make you skeptical. Or is it unlocking that expertise,
Mhm.
right, to save time?
Yeah.
So if you have a rational, responsible provisioning process, I think that you'd be able to understand whether or not you believe it would save that time.
Here
Bob,
again, it seems.
let me just
Go
do a final comment on that.
Okay.
In the previous generation, trade compliance was an afterthought to the big ERP systems. And most of them, whether SAP or Oracle, did a module, but it was an afterthought to be integrated. And what we want to see really with AI is whether it's going to be totally integrated as companies adopt AI for more general purposes, whether the trade function will really be considered at the forefront.
Hmm. Certainly, the enterprise vendors would like you to think so, that they have that capability, but whether that's the case or not will be remain to be seen. But let's quickly move on to our final theme that we've talked about today, and that is ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and supply chain resilience. Marianne, how are companies today building resilient and adaptable supply chains?
Governments want visibility into everything in the supply chain. And so companies are really turning to technology solutions that provide that visibility. So, an example of that, many of the companies that started on the sanction side, really to give you those business relationships, have now flipped over to the import side and forced labor. And
Right.
multinational companies, I think, are being forced to use these technologies in a way that they never were before, because it's not even just the compliance, demonstrated compliance through CBP audits, or it's that reputational risk. That's why things like forced labor are so difficult, I think, for companies to deal with. It's the reputational risk first and foremost. So they're being forced to adopt these technologies.
Hmm. Okay, though, I do want to talk a little bit more, though, about this idea of diversifying supply chains and mitigating risks. From the standpoint of ESG and supply chain resilience, what strategies are effective for achieving that goal? Marianne?
So most companies are really surprised, or most people are really surprised when they find out that Malaysia and not China is the country that has the most shipments or value under UFLPA enforcement. And companies should carefully review that dashboard. So I think that companies really need to assess their sourcing vis-a-vis their consumer markets, because I think the knee-jerk reaction for many companies is to say, okay, we'll just move out of China into Southeast Asia. But that is filling up with capacity, and that's why I highlighted Malaysia. Is you have to be really careful to that other country that you may be sourcing from, because you may have the same problems.
Hmm.
And
Andrew, what is your outlook, your insight into that?
yeah, I mean, just piggybacking off of what Marianne just said, when you have challenges that are diverse and they're unpredictable, you're going to need to get a diverse set of solutions to have those options open, but how do you make it predictable? So what does that mean? It means if you have more locations, you also have more vendors in more locations. And the upside with more vendors is you can reduce logistics costs, right? You can shorten the proximities, you can streamline your schedules, but the downside is you have more vendors, which means more vendors in your supply chain. So you've got more complexity and more expectations to know your supplier. And so with that is going to come the need for more management, more automation. And you don't want to create a new problem by trying to get out of the old one. The other thing to keep in mind is circumvention risk, right? Where the question even comes up, like, how would I even screen for that? I'm shipping to Turkey and it's shown in lists as legit, but we know that the government has told us that for, these products, Turkey's a circumvention and diversion spot. So now I have to become sort of an investigative reporter to determine whether the party I'm selling to looks clear. So that's where data really becomes king, right? Where having a deeply sourced and up to the minute content is really going to be a must, because you're going to need to know, like, what are the politically exposed persons? What is the adverse media? What is the deep data that supports all of this?
So, look, I'd like to get over to move to the question and answer portion of our presentation today, and we do have a number of audience questions that have already come in. But however, audience members should feel encouraged to continue to submit your questions while we're answering those, and we'll get to as many of those as we can, time permitting. So this question from the audience says, can you please explain the difference between the different kinds of tariffs? I hear tariffs and sometimes retaliatory tariffs and 301 or 232. Marianne, help us sort that out.
Okay, so unfortunately, we have the trade lingo, and whenever you hear a number like 301, 232, or 201, that refers to the portion of the Trade Act or the statute that is the basis for that tariff. Okay, so we have general tariffs, which is in the harmonized tariff schedule, and that is column 1, what we call the MFN, or most favored nation, or general rate. And the average duty rate in the United States is about 2.4%. However, the president is allowed to use other statutes to impose additional tariffs. So tariffs can be cumulative. So you have anti-dumping, I believe that's 201. So that's reference of the statute. And that's going to be the difference that the International Trade Commission, if a country is selling goods or company is selling goods in the U.S. at below market, let's say 50%, it can add 50% in duties to bring it up to a level playing field. 301, which is the most predominant now with China, deals with intellectual property violations, but also other problematic trade practices. And that can be anywhere over 100%. But now, in the first Trump administration, we had about 25% to 30% added to a broad base of goods. And that could be more. He's talking about 60%. And those are all cumulative. So you have to really look at the basis for that tariff action. And all those duties are listed in Chapter 99 of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule.
Thank you. This is a question about skills. What are the basics of the new continuing education requirement from customs?
Excellent question. So all licensed customs brokers are obligated in this triennial period from 2024 to 2027 to get 20 credit hours of continuing education. You can take a customs education course that are free. You can go to any education provider. So by the time you have to file your triennial report by January 31st, 2027, you have to have evidence that you've attended 20 credit hours, and you have to get a code for completion of that course. In future triennial periods, that will go up to 36 credit hours. So because customs took a year to roll out the program, it prorated the continuing education requirements to only 20 this year, or this period, I should say.
Mhm. Question about technology. What you can get to make an impact. And is there any low? What do you think, Marianne? Maybe.
I'm sorry, it's a
All the solutions, all the possible technology solutions we've talked about today, and I mean, there's so many related to some aspect of supply chain management. What is this questioner wants to know what's the most effective one that a corporation can now to make an impact and maybe reach what they refer to as low-hanging fruit, the easy wins that you can get by adapting certain aspect of technology in your organization today.
Oh gosh, it really depends on your company and the industry that you're in. If
Yeah.
you're a regulated industry and you're a multinational company and you don't have a global trade management solution, you're just asking for trouble. If you're a smaller company, even in the e-commerce space, it's a harder issue because now there are companies that are developing these, I would say, more generic workflow and trade node order fulfillment tracking software, and those are online, and that's pretty good. But I would start with tariff classification because um, so much potential penalties and risk flows from the classification of your goods.
Mm-hmm. Questioner says, what's the biggest risk you see in diversifying the supply chain?
Oh gosh. Well, it adds complexity.
Mm.
The more supply chains you have, the more source markets you have, the more you have to manage. When everybody was sourcing out of China, it was easy, and those logistics were pretty easily to bank on. The more countries you have and the geographies are different, maybe the logistics aren't as good in that country, you got a problem. That's why China has had such a hold on manufacturing is the world-class logistics. Canada and Mexico are pretty good because of their proximity. But other countries in Latin America, it's a geography issue. The land-based logistics is almost non-existent, so it has to be ocean-based. But a lot of them don't have the ports,
Mm-hmm.
although China is investing in Latin American ports. So it's really a case-by-case basis, and it's going to be more complexity for a trade pro to manage.
Yeah. Questioner wants to know what is the biggest risk you see in diversifying the supply chain? Maybe you can get each of you to chime in on this one.
You really have to be with the business people, the business development people. You have to really be proactive as a trade professional and plan those things at the outset. Trade professionals used to be on the back end of dealing with issues as the goods were ready to be shipped. You can't do that anymore. You have to be at the forefront in the planning stages of where you're sourcing from. So the more you can anticipate any potential surprises and iron out those details beforehand, or at least provide options to the company's management, the better off you're going to be because
Mm-hmm.
it's the surprises that are the compliance issues um, that will really keep a trade professional up at night.
Yeah, and Marianne, I've heard from many people who are spending more and more time on things like product compliance that are a little bit, a little bit further back in the stream than when you're shipping the product. What is the compliance of the product itself? I think the biggest risk is not keeping up with the changes, and the changes are, they almost feel infinite. There are literally millions of data points changing each year. And so making sure that you have access to easily accessible content, I think is just absolutely crucial, no matter what size organization you are. An earlier question asked about low-hanging fruit. I think something that would do that and would also provide analytics is really going to be your friend, and is probably going to be there are options that are out there that can provide that sort of solution for you where you want to say, well, is this trade lane versus this trade lane? Or what is tariff right now, right this moment for this? Are there other fees? Are there other issues? So I would call that out as well.
Thanks. I'm not sure if anyone can answer this question yet. It may just be too early, but I will pose it anyway. The questioner is asking about the newly anticipated ERS, the External Revenue Service, and how that will square with what Customs does and how that will affect the tariffs that are coming online February 1st and beyond.
My personal opinion, and this is just my personal opinion, the External Revenue Service is a marketing tool. Okay. Now, it is true that the first 150 years of the United States, we primarily had tariffs as federal revenue. So it's customs duties and excise taxes collected by customs since July 4th, 1789. It was like the third statute passed. The creation of the External Revenue Service is sort of a misnomer. But I think what the president wants to do is he wants to create in the public's mind there's a difference between Internal Revenue Service, which collects income taxes or direct taxes, versus an External Revenue Service that collects indirect taxes, meaning customs duties. Now, the United States is the largest economy that doesn't have a VAT, and he's never value-added tax, and he's never talked about it. But to create the perception that foreigners are paying these external taxes is sort of a misnomer. And what I can see happening is having two separate buckets of customs duties that go right into the general revenue of the Treasury and internal revenue taxes, meaning income taxes. But no matter how much he raises customs duties, it will not be enough to finance the current government that we have. U.S. Customs collects around $90 billion in duties. Now, that's the second largest revenue generating agency, but it's not even close to the $4 trillion or whatever the IRS raises every year. So, and he's talked about eliminating the income tax, which that would go back to our original, the nation's original financing. But you can't have a welfare state and the large federal government we have with the revenues that he's talking about from customs duties, no matter how much he raises customs duties, unless he really pairs the federal government. But that's where Congress really has to, reshape that policy.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. We have time for one final question. I'm going to pose this to Marianne. What top 3 short, medium, and long-term takeaways would you recommend for our listeners today for them to stay compliant with evolving international trade regulations?
First, short-term, read. It's changing on a daily basis, so you've got to read as much as possible. Midterm, if you're a licensed customs broker, let the continuing education requirement help you diversify your knowledge and skill base. Make a career plan with where you want to take your career, because I think you're going to have to do more planning of your career, and talk with your employer to see if they will integrate that education and skills upgrade to, your internal reviews and your performance goals. And then long term, when you know what your current employer is willing to do in terms of education and skills, and if you're getting rewarded for it, and plan the next move based on an educational program to get ahead.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much, both of you, Andrew Moxon and Marianne Rowden, for this great presentation. Some really essential, vital issues that are so in flux right now. So it's great to get that type of guidance as to what traders might be doing in order to deal with these uncertainties going forward. We want to offer you this link to Thomson Reuters 2024 Global Trade Report. If we could bring up that slide, it will have a QR code to download a copy of this report. Just scan that QR code to get it. And if you don't have time to do that in the last few seconds of this webinar, don't worry about it. That will be provided to all the people, all attendees of this webinar. So once again, I want to thank my great speakers for today. I want to thank our audience for your participation, for your great questions as well. Everybody, have a fantastic day.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Marianne.
Thanks, Bob.
And thanks.